they need to here. So hello everybody and welcome. You are at Focus on Vulnerabilities That Matter with Recorded Future and ServiceNow, and the whole hope today is to demonstrate to you a little bit of the value of doing vulnerability response on ServiceNow, and then how you can maybe extend some of your current practices, using Recorded Future and other providers that are going to be able to enrich that vulnerability data. So that's what we're hoping to cover a little bit today. So here today with me, I've got Glenn Wong and Carl Kleisig from Recorded Future and ServiceNow, respectively. I'm going to let everybody do a little bit of intro of themselves, just to describe, kind of where they fit in the puzzle here. So Glenn, why don't I hand it over to you?
Great, thanks, Chris. Hey everyone, this is Glenn Wong from Recorded Future. I'm a director of product management here, where I work very closely with our technology partners on integrations, and then with our engineering team, work on developing all the different APIs that to power those integrations. We've been working with ServiceNow and Thirdera for about 2 years now, and are really excited to have this opportunity to speak more publicly about some of the great work we've been doing together. Carl, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Glenn. I would echo Glenn's sentiment. We're really excited about spending this time on this series. And as Chris mentioned, I'm Carl Kleisig. So I focus at ServiceNow on our security operations solution. So security incident response and vulnerability response. And we'll be touching base on vulnerability response today, but looking forward to the session, and thanks for your attendance.
Awesome. Thanks, Carl. And yeah, just real briefly, I'm Chris Bailey. So I'm a technical consultant at Thirdera. I'm part of the security operations and custom applications team. So I've helped a lot with implementing security operations applications and vulnerability response at various organizations. Also specializing kind of in building integrations. So I've worked with Recorded Future and some other partners as far as exchanging information with the platform. So yeah, hoping to use some of this, the experts in the room here, and we'll give you a little bit of information as far as hitting the ground running with vulnerability response, and some ways that maybe you could take your practice to the next level. So just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. We want to talk a little bit about not just today, but also what we're going to be covering with the series of webinars here. That'll be real brief. And then we want to start digging into vulnerability response and talking about some of the risk factors that are real typical in vulnerability response. Initially, especially as people get started, sometimes we just turn on our scanners and get going, and we want to know, okay, well, what's next? And we want to highlight, okay, how do you get from where you are today to maybe some good ideas for the future? Then we're going to dig in a little bit how vulnerability response is sort of architected on ServiceNow. So people that are maybe a little bit newer to the platform, we can talk a little bit about kind of that overall purview and how you take some of these risk factors that we're discussing, in vulnerability generally, and then how that applies to ServiceNow. And then we'll get into a little bit of a demo that just kind of highlights the value propositions that we're talking about. So with that, I'm going to jump in a little bit. So the series overview here, just wanted to kind of let everybody know in case you hadn't noticed, we are putting on a 3-part series here where not just today where we're talking about vulnerability response, we'll also have 2 episodes in the upcoming weeks discussing security incident response, as well as vendor risk management. So if those topics are also of interest, you can keep an eye out on our LinkedIn and some emails that I'm sure will come out for information about those in the future. So want to start out just this discussion of risk factors. When we talk about vulnerabilities, what exactly are we trying to get our head around? And for this, I am going to hand it over to Glenn to kind of help paint a picture of what we're trying to manage.
Great, thanks, Chris. We thought it might be easiest to start this conversation with an analogy, because vulnerabilities, I think folks have a certain mindset, or it could be quite a technical thing to consider, and the risks may seem a little bit more esoteric. So let's start by considering your set of vulnerabilities, the things that you need to patch and fix, similar to maintaining a fleet of cars. And one of the easiest things to think about is when you're maintaining your fleet of cars is what's the inherent risk of some of the things that you need to take care of. As you can see on that left-hand box, there may be routine maintenance like oil changes. There might be things that pop up on an ad hoc basis, like a manufacturer recall, or there may be issues that happen, like failed safety inspections because of age, or some sort of incident that happened with some of your vehicles. That kind of inherent risk is often where vulnerability management begins, and often it's just tied with this idea of what you learn from CVSS and from our NVD. I think an equally important risk to consider is actually what we call here the company-specific risk, or something about the asset. In this case, cars, but for vulnerabilities, it'd be your servers and such. That's intrinsic to how you use that. In this case, a vehicle, right? So you may have some vehicles that have relatively low priority. I was imagining like golf carts that you use to maybe traverse the campus in your large business, or it could be maybe more important vehicles that are used for mission critical deliveries, right? So the inherent value of that asset, or that in this case vehicles, implies some sort of risk to you as well, right? Maybe you have a very mission critical vehicle, but it's the only one of its kind. So your risk is actually quite high, because if you lose access to that vehicle, or if that vehicle breaks down, then you could have downstream operations that are severely affected. Then on the far right, you can see there's another type of risk, which I think is very important when you think about vehicle maintenance, but in the vuln side is often overlooked, I should say, right? And this is information about what is the sort of environment or the global setting in which these vehicles are operating. We say global because it sort of happens outside of your company, and we say it's temporal because it also can be time-based, right? It could be things that are important today, but maybe not so much tomorrow. So some of it could just be safety of the roads or the areas that your vehicles are operating in.
And Glenn, if I think of that analogy, it ties in well with the environment we're all in today, right? As we talk about how many of us are working remotely versus a very short time ago in the scheme of things.
Absolutely, right. And also in the kind of nature of the things we're hearing about, not just the remote access, but some of these attacks on pipelines and infrastructure, right? So the kind of country we're in, the kind of operating system, the kind of industry we're in, have these sort of global and temporal risks, right? And again, you can see the analogy very easily from a vehicle perspective, but I think there's a straightforward way to imagine that from a vulnerability and cybersecurity perspective that is often overlooked, and certainly this is something that we want to raise to everyone's awareness, that each of these different risk factors is an important piece to look at and to weigh its importance to you and your organization. So with that, let me hand it back to Chris to bring it to the specific theme that we've got for this talk around vulnerabilities.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Glenn. Yeah. I think the analogy is great. It definitely highlights, the different types of risk that we're talking about, and sort of wanted to picture it as a pie here, because that's really what we're trying to portray, is that, when you talk about risk to your organization, we're trying to break that up into manageable, pieces of the pie, so that you understand, okay, well, what are the types of things that we're trying to manage? So you've got your inherent risk when we talk about vulnerabilities. How risky is this exploit? Does it allow remote access? Or just the things about the vulnerability itself. And then we can start to layer in, okay, well, is this important to me? Is that asset in production? Is it mission critical or not? And then the rest of the picture, when we start talking about global risk, is are there other things outside of my organization that really matter? Is this currently being exploited in the wild, and things like that? So to kind of help paint that picture, when we see this, you really can break this down into multiple different factors that different providers are going to give you. So when you're a vulnerability customer who first starts out, and you hook up, a Qualys, Tenable, Rapid7s of the world, you hook up one of their scanners in your environment, you're going to get a lot of data initially that starts to talk about, okay, what's my CVSS, or what's my scanner score? And you can kind of see that in the upper left in the purple there. That's sort of that first phase of maturity, where it's like, okay, well, I have a scanner and I can tell what's risky in my environment. But that by itself doesn't really help me to prioritize, what does this mean to me? What does it mean to my organization? So that's where a lot of customers, have taken they started doing discovery. We started with CMDB. We have a lot of data that's sitting on top of ServiceNow that we can start to take advantage of. We know what's in production and what isn't. We have a good idea of maybe what's outside of my firewall out, or out in the DMZ versus what's internal. So there's different levels of risk maybe associated with that. So, when we start to picture a maturity roadmap, I want to get to a point that I'm not just looking at, okay, here's what the scanner can give me, but I also want to marry that up against, things that I know about the assets in my environment, and start to make more intelligent decisions that way. And then we get towards like that third phase, which I think is, what we're also trying to help picture today is that like Glenn said, there's these additional factors outside the organization that you traditionally might not get from just looking at CVSS, right? CVSS isn't going to necessarily tell you everything that you want to know about what's currently going on in the world or how it might affect your geography, things like that. So, when we start talking about, like in the blue at the bottom, you can see exploit activity or active campaigns. We start talking about, I need someone who's more of an expert in the industry that can help bring data to me that's going to help me adapt to what's currently going on. CVSS isn't necessarily going to give me that timely, like, this is exactly what I need right now. So, that's what we're trying to kind of relay here, is that all three of these areas are part of kind of that whole picture. And I think it's sort of a maturity roadmap in some ways to say, as you get going with vulnerability response, we want to make sure we're accounting for each of these and making it part of the vulnerability calculators. We want to make sure that our risk scores are getting set appropriately so that we can start to prioritize things, and make sure we're focusing on patching the things that really matter, to pull that risk out of the environment.
And if I may, Chris, one of the big things that
absolutely.
you think about there, when like what Glenn was describing as an example, is that the reality is that that context is so incredibly valuable, because we all know that when it comes to area 2, as things change, because you have all that different context, you can reflect it in 3 very quickly, as opposed to just a scan, correct? So that's actually the exciting part when we think about what we all face, is that ability to be, instead of reactionary, actually be almost prognosticators, knowing that, these type of leading indicators spell this out for us, right?
Absolutely, yeah. You can start to even get more predictive analytics and things in that area as well to let you know what's coming. Awesome.
Hey, Chris,
yeah.
if I can add just one more comment too. We work with a variety of clients, and I think the ones that for whom this is really important is when you have more things to patch, right? Your scanner results are so large that you can't fix it all, right? Because you could imagine if you've got, take an extreme example. Let's say you're a small business and you've got 5 machines, and they all have some, you scan them, they've got some patches. Well, it's not unreasonable to say, I'm just going to patch all 5, right? And the scanner can tell you exactly what you need to patch and why those patches matter. But now imagine you're a big company and you've got 5,000 things that come up, right? And you've got finite folks on your IT team who can cycle through and fix things. Now, this is why these different risk factors start to matter, because you now need to make trade-offs between where I start and where I can effectively focus my efforts, because I have limited resources and limited time.
Yeah, that's a good point, and we'll definitely dive into that with the demo in a moment. But that is something we ought to highlight, because I mean that's the traditional problem when you start talking about vulnerability response in these large organizations, right? And I'm sure, Carl, you could speak to some of like the larger ones you've seen where you've got 40 million, 80 million plus vulnerable items that you want to try to prioritize.
And clarifying an example with what Glen's saying is, we'll have some customers get genuinely excited because they will have taken their backlog from what would be tens of thousands to thousands. No exaggeration, right? And they're thrilled. They're absolutely ecstatic that they're accomplishing this. So yeah, Glen's dead on with that.
Absolutely. All right, well, so we're almost, we got one more slide here to discuss kind of the process. So Carl, did you want to talk to kind of how vulnerability response is going to flow on the platform and where this fits in?
Absolutely. So as you heard, Glenn and Chris talk through the different levels of business context and threat intelligence, all these things that really make it so that you can drive to automating and being much more almost proactive, like you've heard us hint at here, right? So that ability to go ahead and put in some automation and enable your teams to be that much faster, more responsive, and reduce that backlog quickly. So what you see here is basically that flow. As we take all this information, these capabilities, combine that with the automation, essentially from left to right, you're ingesting that scanner data like we talked about, but then you're also getting all that different context space. That's enrichment from the threat intelligence vendors like Recorded Future, right? You're going ahead and you're taking that business context, and then when you look at, in area 3, as you're sitting there with that automated triage, you're able to go ahead and take that directly from our CMDB, that database, utilize that data, and now you're prioritizing the work based on just the not just based on the vulnerability score, but also by that information like the exploitability that Chris was talking about and the criticality of the assets and the services mapped. So in other words, when you're prioritizing it, you're making an extremely accurate prioritization. So at the end of the day, when we accomplish that, once we determine which vulnerabilities must be addressed first, we can automatically group those into those work tasks based on your requirements, such as asset owner, location, etc. Right? So essentially, all the patches required are associated so that you can remediate them via integrations with Microsoft Security Response Center, Red Hat, others like we've called out here as examples. And that actually enables you to go ahead and include which patches will provide the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak. That goes back to some of what you heard Chris touch on there. So that there's really no more guessing game as to which patches must apply first, right? So it's a real exciting outcome of everything that you've heard Chris and Glenn talk about, with being able to really make the team that much more effective. And then at the end of the day, when we're all done with this process, we can do a rescan request to make sure that the patch was successfully applied. And then you can go ahead with our combined solutions, be able to track, manage, and report on all that. So you can report up, you can report to the team, you can understand where you're effective and where you're not. So in a nutshell, pardon my speed, I'm a native New Yorker, so I naturally just kind of go right on through. But I hope that gives you a good vision into what you can accomplish with these type of capabilities and with the automation. Chris?
Excellent. Yep. Thanks, Carl. Yeah, and trying to piggyback off that with, the goal here is I want to get into a ServiceNow instance and actually take a look at what this is going to look like, on the fly. So let's jump over to our instance here. And I got to do this. All right, so let me, oh, that's back to the same screen here. Hold on a second. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without a couple fumbles, right? Okay, so let me jump inside the instance here. So, this is a demo environment. I mean, I started out with that caveat, right? We've talked about the average customer environment is going to have, many, many thousands and millions of these kinds of records. But that's not the point. The point here is to do something that's a little more illustrative and just talk to, what is the value of what we're proposing and how do you get there, So if I take a look at my vulnerable items here, we've got just the active ones that are currently highlighted. We're looking at 300-ish here. And you can see I've got, several that are very critical here if I'm looking at these risk scores. I've already got, several that are already 100. I've maxed out the risk as high as it can go. And there's several other criticals. And how do I make sense of that, right? So in the average environment, if I started to look at this and said, man, I've already on this first screen just got, oranges and reds everywhere, that's easily 30+% of what I've got to look at. And if there's millions of these, where do I start? I mean, and the short answer might be yes, start with the hundreds, but even there, how do I get that risk out of my environment the most quickly? So you can take another gander at how this is organized. I've got just a simple report here where I can see vulnerable items by risk rating. So I'm just looking at those, risk scores and based on the different bands, the 80 to 100s, so I've got my most critical items and so on. I can see right away that, yeah, okay, 8% of the environment's critical and I've got 36% in this high. And if I was just focused on just those, if I just wanted to say, okay, everything that's above this like 60, 70% risk range, I want to eliminate from my environment, I've got to take care of 43+% of my environment. So as I'm kind of, talking about this here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply just a change to the calculator rules, right? So when I am looking at this is kind of simulating what would happen if I just turned on the scanner and I just had this dumping into my environment. It's just bringing in, here's what Collis thinks, or here's what Tenable, Rapid7, here's what they think combined with CVSS, and now I've got a score, right? So if I'm just focusing on that, you can see I get a pretty large percentage that I have to handle. Now, if I apply another calculator that says, okay, well, let's take into account some other factors. Let's do those environmental factors that we talked about. So how critical are these services? Or, are they inside, outside the firewall? Is it production or not? All that environmental stuff. So if I start to look at that and then let this recalculate, so I'm going to go ahead and run, you can see, and I'll have a side-by-side at the end so we can sort of review kind of what these look like next to each other and you don't have to just watch me wave my hands and pretend that it's magic, right? I've already gotten down to, if I add my 5 and my 24 here, I'm around 30%. So I went from 43 down to 30-ish%. And that was just based on taking those environmental factors into play. So the idea is now if I look at my environment, I should be able to help prioritize, just that little bit extra, right? Like I'm 11% more efficient or 13%, more than I was before. And the whole hope is that something got 3,400. um, the whole hope is that you're going to be able to shrink your effort, and by doing that, you're going to be able to focus your change management and your patch management more effectively on getting that risk out of the environment more quickly. So that's just the level one, right? Like that's just saying, okay, I want to take into account my CMDB data. The hope is that then as we start to talk about taking, Recorded Future or some of these other third-party, threat intelligence providers, you can bring that data in and take some of that environmental data and supplement it with additional global, temporal data. That's when you're going to get to the next level here. So I'm going to go ahead and just have that apply its calculation, and we should be able to see the results here in a moment. Oops, and let's bring that back for a moment. Otherwise, we're going to get all sorts of things we didn't intend. All right, and because I did that, it took the sort out. So let's make sure that the criticals show up first, just so we have a good display here. All right, so back to our picture here. And you can see that as we've applied the recorded future data and changed the sorting order and all the dancing, the hope here is that now as we're applying that data, you can see that we're shrinking these pie slices. 12.7, I'm around 9, so I'm looking at somewhere in like a 21, 22% range. So I started at 43 and I've cut that in half. And really, that's the idea that we're trying to get across here, is that as you start to apply these other factors, you're going to be able to exponentially, focus yourself on the things that matter. And that's really kind of the point. It's not just that you're going to get all this data and you're going to be swimming through it. It's that when you start to look at how it helps you to prioritize things and you use these calculators to drive those intelligent decisions, that's really where you're going to start to see that value. So we just really wanted to bring these charts into play to help drive that home. For customers that are potentially then interested in using that data, it's not just this aggregate data. These integrations like a Recorded Future are going to refresh because that timed out. They're going to enable you to make those intelligent decisions, so you can actually still dive in and get additional details here. So if I take a look at, let's say, one of these CVEs here, so this 2017 CVE, just wanted to highlight, how it's using this data to help, drive the scoring, right? So if I've got a vulnerable item that's related to the CVE, so I've got, a Windows vulnerability here that happens to be related to, some ransomware from back in 2017. Might sound kind of familiar based on some of the ransomware activity that we've seen recently. So on these CVEs, we're going to have the recorded future data then available to us. So somebody that wants to dive in and say, okay, based on CVSS, I can say that this is a score of 70. Well, what does recorded future think that this is and why? I can start to dive in and say, okay, well, recorded future knows that this one is currently pretty risky. It's got a score of 99. There's various evidence that's going to substantiate that risk score. I can start to dive in and I can say, okay, Recorded Future can tell me that this is currently being exploited in the wild, which is a good reason to be very aware of this one right now. If there's exploits going around, that might be one of the first things that I want to patch. So that's where you're going to see differences between Recorded Future score and what you might get from just the beginning sources when you start to bring in the scanner data. You can see, other sources like NIST, things like that. Occasionally, you'll have even specific URLs that you could dive into for more information. And that's really the point to drive home with sort of this view, is that you can get to whatever depth you want to within here. So somebody that's doing some more investigation, that wants to start from this level, can use this intelligence then to kind of drive how they're going to manage those patches, find out what exploits are out there, find out, what fixes are available for those exploits. So with that, I think we're going to jump back to our presentation. Let me just get back to this guy here. And if there are any questions, feel free to paste them in the chat and we will try to handle them here. But yeah, so from here, I just wanted to bring up the charts again. So as we went across these different areas, just to highlight these differences, make sure that it was a little more visible side by side and that we weren't just, trying to flash that across the screen here. So one thing to mention with this is just to make sure they understand that these are aggregates of each other. So when you start to look at inherent, environmental, and temporal, those aren't distinct from each other. The idea is that you're layering one on top of the other, right? So it's when I take the inherent risk of the vulnerability, that's still important. I want to know how significant this risk is, but it's by adding those environmental factors and understanding if it's inside or outside my organization or remotely accessible and all those things. That's where I start to be able to trim this down. So it's that as we move across, we're able to start to focus those things by adding in that intelligence. All right, let's see. I see a question here from Daniel. So let's go ahead and maybe just take a gander at that. So Daniel says, when the Recorded Future plugin and config is installed, does the related data auto-populate, or is there some configuration needed for visibility from the CVE record view? So I can handle that one if that's all right. And then Glenn, feel free to just supplement me if there's any Recorded Future stuff you want to touch on. There is a little bit of configuration on the view to handle displaying the Recorded Future information. So the very first thing is that when you set up Recorded Future, you will have to get an API token established through your subscription with Recorded Future. There's some instructions in the administrator guide for the integration about how to procure that throughout the application. Once you have that, you'll be able to just start bringing information in. So you can essentially, through a couple steps, start the download of the Recorded Future information. And then, so I can highlight this. When you open up the connector for Recorded Future, you're going to basically place your API information into here. And then you'll be able to connect to the integration. And then there is a process to trigger actually downloading it. Once you have the information being downloaded, what we can do is, the default in the system is that it's going to just have the normal ServiceNow layouts for these screens. And I think I clicked on it. There we go. All right, let me bring up a NVD so I can address your question here, Daniel. When you bring up these screens, it won't have these Recorded Future tabs with the additional enrichment by default. So because the CVEs are essentially part of a different application scope, they can't be loaded by default with the integration, but it's very easy to add them. So if you go up here and just configure the related lists, the information is directly accessible. So you can add and subtract different Recorded Future information from these related lists and order them however you'd like. There's the possibility of creating additional relationships and things as well if you had a more advanced use case that you needed to filter or anything like that. But yeah, at its most basic, yes, you just add the Recorded Future information here. And most of that should be covered, I think, in the installation guide.
Yeah, Chris, let me maybe expand on your response a bit too, right? Because
Sure.
I interpreted the question a little bit around, to get information, around our vulnerabilities and such. Is that an automated process? Is it manual?
Sure.
Tell us a little bit more about that scope. And so there's sort of two different ways that information actually can get loaded in. One is, as you bring your scanner results in, and they have identified vulnerabilities, you can then match it up to, Recorded Future information to find out, some of these other types of risks, what we're calling the global or temporal risk associated with those different vulnerabilities, right? And that can be an automated process. And then, as Chris just showed, there are different ways you configure the screens to see that information. But the application can take care of the automated loading of that information and assign it to the assets or to the scan results you have. There's a different mode of operation in our application, which is also to say, Recorded Future, the set of vulnerabilities that are known is a finite set, right? It's, somewhere between 100 and 200,000. And, which ones are the most risky, even if they don't exist on my system, right? Even if I don't have an asset that's affected by them, I might want to know about them as a way to kind of get a sense of what sort of exploits are out there, what kind of vulnerabilities are there. And maybe I might want to watch them for, my own threat hunting purposes, or, as a check on some of the technologies that we rely on, even if they're not necessarily part of my internal stack. So that is another mode of operation that our integration allows for.
Yep, absolutely. That's a good call out. Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question, Daniel. Yeah, and if there are any others, feel free to keep them coming.
There was another one that had come up, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely.
It says, what data sources are typically used for layering of inherent company and global risk? So I'm happy to take that one, actually. So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of the inherent risk, that's often a combination of what your scanner results pull back in combination with a central database like NVD, right? So that's basically the inherent risk is what kind of software, what kind of devices do I have on my network? That's what the scanner helps you identify, and then that marries it up with what might be known in something like a national vulnerability database. Pretty straightforward. There are, obviously a number of different solutions that do that. In terms of the company risk, that's often an internal data set, right? Either something like a CMDB that you might be populating within ServiceNow, or some other asset that you have internally that inventories what you have and how it's being used, right? And Chris mentioned a few things like, is it internet facing? Is it a machine that's being used by some of your senior executives, for example, or is it part of your development environment and something that might be internally focused? So that tells you a little bit more about your company risk, and is often something that will vary company to company depending on how they manage that information internally. And then the global risk, the data sources there are many. Right. So, here we're talking about Recorded Future, where we actually pull from, over, I think last count, it's over 800,000 different sources in real time. Right. And when I say a source, it can be anything from standard news media outlets to social media to forums where, people who develop exploits or who are red team members or who are threat actors are themselves conversing and sharing information about different ways to break into systems. It could be technical information, it could be research articles that are being written by folks who specialize in exploits and looks at threat actor campaigns. So in terms of that global risk, there's a lot of information out there, and one of the challenges is how do you collect from all of them? How do you find the needle in the haystack? And then how do you actually find the bits that matter most to me? And that's certainly where Recorded Future can help you.
Awesome. Thanks, Glenn. Let's see, I saw a question here. Oh yeah, that's Tim's question you just did. All right, awesome. So let's jump back over here. Up. Oh, was there another? Yeah, I see another question. Came in anonymously, so hello, anonymous. What do you see customers do for risk calculations initially? So I think we kind of covered, a little bit earlier that there's sort of this maturity scale, and I think I'm just actually going to jump back to the slide because it'll be a little easier to demonstrate here. I think risk calculations, it definitely grows with you. I think a lot of people start out with the Qualis score and kind of come to that realization that, hey, I've got a lot of information coming in here. So, the challenge is making the weighting factors correct to your organization. That is something that probably requires a little bit of alignment. What I've seen people do that tends to be successful is to actually kind of bring up a spreadsheet and start to actually put in the weighting factors and start to determine, okay, well, if I put in these weights or this amount of risk or whether this is on the internet or internet facing side or not, and start to find out like what really makes sense, what helps it make, a number that really stands out to you. If you start to just try to like take somebody else's answer, you may end up with something that sort of everything merges to the middle and it becomes more difficult to manage. So I really think that that's something that takes a little bit of fine tuning. I would say that with a lot of the integrations that are out there, so whether it's Recorded Future or others, you do see typically they'll make a recommendation for some of those factors and how it can be joined together to come up with at least a calculator that would serve as a good starting point for a lot of organizations. So, if that's saying that, okay, we're going to use Recorded Future, external score as 50% of the weight, and then start to, bring in some of those environmental factors to account for the other 50% or 40%, and then we're going to weigh in some of the scanner score, vulnerability score as well. Those are the types of things that we kind of see people start out with. And like I said, it tends to be an exercise that you try to kind of fine tune. You want to try to make sure that as you're making those decisions, are we really making the correct decisions, or do we need to, tweak them over time? So I don't know if you guys also had any other thoughts about that one.
I think that makes sense. I mean, the organization, there is some time put in, just like you do with, some of your other aspects of security, to adjust the ratings appropriately, the weightings, as it were, for your organization. Can't emphasize enough, you need to be thoughtful about that. Fortunately, when you look at Recorded Future and other contributors, they really help shape that and make it easier and easier for you in the scheme of things. But certainly the time has to be put in up front.
Yeah, agreed. Awesome. Well, I know we've been going on for a while here. Let me jump back to where we were in the presentation. So as far as what's next, just to kind of fill everybody in, we'll definitely have some time here to answer some questions. So feel free to continue to post those in the chat. Did want to highlight that we do have, again, another webinar that'll be coming up to talk about security incident response on top of ServiceNow. So we'll be doing that in the same panel here, same type of discussion. But we're also going to highlight some of the ways that Recorded Future will help to bring additional data into security incident response to help with those processes. There will be a link for this in the chat, I'm sure, here shortly. And if anybody's interested, feel free to check us out there.
There it is.
Oh, there we go. Excellent. Thank you, Anna. And just wanted to also highlight that if you wanted to reach out, if you have any other questions or information, how we've seen this stuff, utilized, feel free to reach out to me personally if you just need a contact to kind of ping some questions off of. So I'm available there at the email address for Thirdera. We're also pretty active on LinkedIn, so if you're looking for any other information regarding the upcoming webinars, as well as other best practices across, security operations or the whole ServiceNow space, I'm sure there's plenty of other information up there as well. So yeah, just wanted to kind of leave it there. We're definitely available to answer more questions if anybody has any that they'd like to bring up in the chat. And I don't know if you're seeing any other ones out there. Okay.
I think we're good.
Well, I think that we're pretty good. It sounds like I rambled on long enough, but no, thank you all. I appreciate everybody's involvement and attention, and yeah, we look forward to connecting again soon.
Thanks everyone for attending, and Chris, thanks so much for leading the discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Great demo.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.